With all the fun I had designing characters for my first Wuthering Heights video, I've decided to come back for another round. The second generation of characters is often less focused on, but the ways they reflect and diverge from their predecessors are crucially important to understanding the story, so I wasn't going to neglect them here. Also, I'm very biased and couldn't pass up an opportunity to talk about Hareton. But Cathy Jr. and Linton deserve their time in the limelight as well, and I've endeavored to create designs for all three which reflect their relationships with their parents and with each other. Note that, as with the last video, this will include spoilers for Wuthering Heights, but to a much greater degree as we're really getting right up to the end of the book. As if this old house on the moors hasn't witnessed enough child abuse already, we're gonna get a lot more. So, let's get into it. Cathy Jr. is a combination of two distinct characters. She's described as mostly resembling her father, but has her mother's eyes and a good deal of her personality. Like the older Cathy, she loves roaming around outside, and she longs to venture past the Grange's park into the world beyond, associating her more with a wild animal than a domestic one. It made sense, then, that she should be a white-furred animal like Edgar, but a wild carnivoran like her mother. The girl's got bite, literally. She digs her teeth into Heathcliff's hand after he locks her in his house. And like with her mother, a mustélid in particular seemed a fitting choice, for Weasel's associations with sneaky and mischievous personalities. Young Cathy is prone to stealthy disobedience, whether sneaking off to Wuthering Heights or exchanging private letters with Linton. As a white-furred weasel, then, the obvious animal option for Cathy was an ermine, or stoat. Ignoring the seasonal color change, that is. Perhaps she's leucistic. These energetic creatures have high metabolisms and very active lifestyles, moving with speed and agility, and lots of bounce. Young Cathy, too, is a bundle of energy, whose idea of paradise is one of wild, sparkling activity. In hunting, stoats may sometimes climb trees to prey on birds and eggs. While she has somewhat more benign intentions, Cathy loves climbing trees and watching the birds in the branches. Her eagerness to scout out eggs even leads her onto Heathcliff's property, where he finds her going after his grouse. To Nellie's chagrin, Cathy is prone to wandering off, constantly landing herself 4 miles from home at Wuthering Heights. And indeed, stoats can quickly cover considerable distances despite their small size. This ability will come in handy later when Cathy has to pull an Isabella and escape from Wuthering Heights, running home to see her father again before he dies. Perhaps there's a connection, too, with the disturbingly young age at which female stoats become sexually mature. Cathy ended up a sort of mother figure to Linton when still a teenager, and was forced into marriage with him when only 17. It's a very messed up relationship in a lot of ways. With Cathy's life changing so dramatically over the course of the story, her outfits had to reflect that. We're at the turn of the century now, when women's fashion has turned to a neoclassical style. White dresses were typical in this time, but Cathy needed something that would stand out against her white fur. For her time living with Edgar at Thrushcross Grange, I've gone with pink. She has her mother's energy and strong will, but can be mild and gentle like her father. So she wears a more desaturated color than the older Cathy's fiery red, but still somewhat reminiscent of it. I imagine that Edgar has dressed his daughter as such in remembrance of his parted wife, for whom he named her, but also in the hopes that she will stay his little girl forever. In a way, the pink is to red what the diminutive Cathy is to Catherine, the name he used for his wife. Young Cathy also has a touch of yellow in her hat in order to match with her father's color scheme, since the two are extremely close. Unfortunately, Cathy's time with her father will be abruptly cut short. In 1801, Heathcliff has shut her up in Wuthering Heights to continue his revenge scheme, and she's not having a good time, to say the least. There's certainly an irony to the pink at this point, with the perversion of its typical symbolism, the grotesque falsity of her romance, and the ending of her youthful innocence. But the shadow of her mother's red remains. In the face of adversity, Cathy shows her predecessor's fiery rebelliousness, even threatening to burn the house down. But for Heathcliff, she's nothing to the original Cathy. He's clawed up her ear for her defiance, which indicates her situation's close parallel to Isabella's, as well as the way Heathcliff makes others like himself, passing on a legacy of bitterness and vengeful desire. And indeed, before long, Cathy will have adopted the color of Heathcliff's clothing as well. In one of the few explicit mentions of clothing color in the book, she's described as wearing black when Lockwood first encounters her, seen as Linton and her father have recently died and she's in mourning. But it also indicates how her trauma and confinement are bringing her temperament closer to Heathcliff's, embittered and disdainful of her company. She's Cathy Heathcliff now, a bitter irony for herself and for her father-in-law, who would have preferred a different Cathy to bear his name. Everything has been twisted out of shape in the relationships of these families, which is nowhere clearer than in the name of Linton Heathcliff. Linton is described as strongly resembling his mother and uncle while bearing no resemblance to his father, Heathcliff, so his animal had to reflect that. He's another white-furred domestic herbivore, a rabbit like his mother, but I went for a different breed, a lop rabbit. Linton has none of Isabella's sparkle, but rather a languid look, so instead of her alert and upright ears, his are drooping. Lop rabbits tend to have health issues due to their skull shape, and their drooping ears impair their body temperature regulation, which is something Linton clearly struggles with. A couple mentions of rabbits in the book correlate quite well with Linton. When young Cathy is visiting Wuthering Heights and Linton is preoccupied with his wet shoes, Heathcliff asks him to entertain the guest, to go show her a rabbit or a weasel's nest. Cathy, of course, is a weasel. There's also another noteworthy scene in the novel's early chapters, when Lockwood is desperately seeking some subject of conversation to engage Cathy. He points out what he thinks is a group of kittens, his own species, only to realize it's actually a pile of dead rabbits. This takes place not long after Linton's death. Cathy scornfully replies that this would be a strange choice of favorites, and indeed Linton was a strange choice of favorite for her, given their incompatible personalities. Stoats and rabbits are hardly a good match when the former prey on the latter. This incompatibility is thus even starker than between a marten and sheep. As in Wedding the Young Parallels, Heathcliff hopes to exaggerate the absurdity of Edgar's marriage to the original Cathy. A wild Musteelid is just too much for Lagomorph Linton. He wails about the pain she put him through by shoving his chair, and her idea of fun distresses him. And when Cathy is first held captive at Wuthering Heights, Linton is legitimately afraid of her wildness, to the point where she terrifies him into disobeying his father. Heathcliff, as a leopard, also regards rabbits as prey. So unfortunately, poor Linton spends much of his time at Wuthering Heights living in fear. A rabbit like him would have been happier living down in the valley at Thrushcross Grange, in the comfort of a low area like a burrow. But nothing in this story works out well for Linton. When Linton first moves to northern England and encounters the other characters, he's a fragile 12-year-old described as wearing a fur-lined cloak even in the prime of summer. Yes, he's a rabbit wearing fur, but this reflects the inherent irony of his existence as Linton Heathcliff. There's also the grim sense of his being regarded as simply bound for death, and his being prevented from ever developing into a true independent self. Just a fur. Frankly, I was having difficulty finding images of fur-lined cloaks for men and boys in this era. I believe coats would have been more typical for them. But then Linton is repeatedly described as a twink, so he doesn't need to dress very masculine. At least, not at this point in his life. By the time Linton is 16, he's moved to formal adult attire, having been shaped by Heathcliff into a parodic sort of head of household. Heathcliff's influence has been strong, but Linton is overall an incongruous sort of hybrid of his father and Edgar's family. He's lost any hint of blue, which is the color I've used for his mother and for the Lintons in general before the siblings' separation. But some of Edgar's fanciness is still evident in Linton's outfit. his bow-tied cravat and big shiny buttons. In contrast, the large lapels and incongruously long tailcoat, more appropriate for a cat than a short-tailed rabbit, match with Heathcliff's attire. Linton exists in a strained relation to his father, both elevated as a personification of Heathcliff's family legacy and property rights, and abused as a personification of the family Isabella named him for. Heathcliff needs the child to be like himself for the satisfaction of creating his own legacy and stealing the Lintons, but he also needs him to be like Edgar as a target of revenge. And he'll never seriously grant that a sickly little bunny is like himself. Linton may be his heir, but the kid in whom Heathcliff actually sees himself is the son of his own abuser, Hareton Earnshaw. Hareton's animal assignment was the easiest for me out of anyone's, given that Lockwood already provided it within the second chapter. On seeing the shaggy, brown-haired man, he refers to him as a bear. This fits in well with my overall scheme of making the Earnshaws brown-furred carnivorans, allowing Hareton to somewhat resemble his Aunt Cathy the pine marten. Bears are animals with a wealth of cultural associations, and one that seems particularly relevant here is the strange belief expressed in bestiaries that cubs are born formless and have to be licked into shape by their mothers. Hareton's problem is that he never really had anybody to lick him into shape. His mother died shortly after his birth, Hindley did nothing but threaten to kill him, and Heathcliff is determined to keep him in an undeveloped state. Bears are sometimes portrayed in folklore and media as oafish brutes who are easily deceived, and Hareton is often regarded by other characters as a dunce wholly ignorant of having been cheated out of his inheritance. But Hareton's much smarter than he's given credit for, eager to learn, and indeed bears are quite clever creatures capable of tool use. This is in spite of their not being very social animals, and Hareton himself seems to struggle with social skills, tending to play and hunt on his own and having difficulty interacting with Cathy Jr. and Linton. Bears are also physically powerful animals, allowing Heathcliff to identify with Hareton and value his strength and courage, much more than he can value anything about his own scrawny son. Heathcliff relishes in the idea that he could easily command Hareton to beat up Hindley if the latter were to crawl out of the grave, and certainly a brown bear would be more than capable of taking on a canid. But Hareton does share something with Hindley, in that brown bears and wolves were once native to Britain but have now gone extinct there. This reflects the loss of the Earnshaws' ancestral territory. Hindley's house was usurped by Heathcliff, and even if Hareton will technically be getting it back in the end, he's no longer going to be living there, leaving the house of his ancient namesake to Joseph and the ghosts. The resemblance in my animal cast between Hareton, Hindley, and Heathcliff is also suggested by their representing substantial groups of large carnivores, bears, dogs, and cats, the former two being closely related biologically, and the latter two being classic rivals. These three characters are all heavily intertwined, even having similar names, all dithematic, nature-themed, and beginning with H. My designs for Hareton are thus intended to reflect similarities with both Heathcliff and Hindley. For much of his life, Hareton lives at Wuthering Heights in a state of so-called degradation, typically engaged in farm labor. Heathcliff clearly recognizes this condition as one in which he himself lived as a teenager, remarking that he knows exactly how Hareton is feeling, and for that reason I've dressed Hareton in the same patchy clothing which Heathcliff wore in his youth. Red, as the Earnshaw color in my outfit scheme, also augments Hareton's identification with his Aunt Cathy, which later begins to disturb Heathcliff. Like a number of other characters, I've given Hareton a ripped left ear, mostly to emphasize the Heathcliff parallel. Since Heathcliff's torn ear in my animal rendition is partially the fault of Hindley, I imagine that the culprit was the same in Hareton's case. It wouldn't have been deliberate this time, but Hindley is always drunkenly carrying around a gun with a spring knife, so accidents are liable to happen, especially after Heathcliff and Nellie leave the Heights and there's no one around to rescue Hareton. Hindley is a man who has accidentally dropped his baby son off a staircase, and also he literally threatens to cut off Hareton's ears at one point, so I've just actualized that. It adds to his rough appearance, which could initially serve to further distance him from the young Cathy, but eventually she'll end up matching him. They've both gone through it, in different ways and at different times, but in the end they'll realize they're more alike than they thought. In 1801, Hareton is dressing a little nicer in an attempt to appeal to Cathy and to give the impression of someone respectable. He's brushed his hair out of his eyes and put on more layers, but his coat is still pretty worn. And eventually, after being rebuffed too many times, Hareton stops trying altogether. In 1802, he's confined to the house after busting up his arm in a hunting accident. A self-caused injury for once, but I did want to suggest resemblance to Hindley in 1784, who also lost a lot of blood in his arm after Heathcliff broke in through his window and beat him up. Hareton is also taken to smoking like Joseph, his third bad influence father figure. But Cathy will cure him of that eventually by throwing his pipe in the fire. Thankfully, things do end up working out between them, and within the year they both end up in a much better place. By the story's conclusion, Hareton is learning to read and has adopted more gentlemanly clothing. Here, a fine tailcoat and cravat. Cathy, her time of mourning over, has shed the black dress and returned to a brighter color. Not her original pink, as things have changed too much for her to be Edgar's little girl again, but a vibrant green. Wuthering Heights has finally opened up its doors, and she's able to roam around outside again. Hareton, for his part, has lost the Earnshaw red he's worn for most of his life, coming to match with Cathy instead. He's leaving his ancestral home to live with her at Thrushcross Grange. Apart from reading, Cathy and Hareton bond by planting flowers in the garden, much to Joseph's anguish, so I've drawn them here with primroses, which Cathy sneaks into Hareton's porridge while dining with Heathcliff. It's a fitting choice of flower, signaling the onset of spring, as things begin to look up from Cathy and Hareton's bleak winter at Wuthering Heights.